Beginnings, the thing that comes before the other things. The beginning of a novel is a very important part of the novel. The beginning is a major determinant for whether a reader sticks around for the rest of the story, because generally if they decide to quit reading, it's because of what was in the beginning. There's a lot of important things that need to happen in the beginning of a novel. You need to introduce your characters and your setting, establish the central conflict, and maybe kick off a few subplots. In addition, you need to set up any promises around the tone of the story and also build some foreshadowing. Your book will also eventually come to its ending, and the ending depends a lot on what happens in the beginning. One might say it entirely depends on what happens in the beginning, but there's a lot to do in the beginning of a book, and there are a lot of ways to do it wrong. A beginning can't be too slow or too fast. It needs to convey information to the reader, but not too much information. And the tone, pacing, and style need to fit with the rest of the narrative. You also need to effectively hook your reader with the plot and the characters. Do any of those things incorrectly and your readers aren't likely to stick around. So with that, here are some tips for writing a great beginning. Now, when I say beginning, I'm not talking about the first page or even the first chapter of the story. What we're talking about today is pretty much everything from the first page up until the inciting incident. Tip number 1. Go at the right speed. This is one of those Goldilocks situations. You don't want to start the book off too slow or too fast. This applies both to the pace of the events in the beginning, whether the story starts off with a car chase or someone laying out their shirts for the week, but also to the rate at which information is presented to the reader. Starting a story with too much action before introducing the characters or the conflict or the setting can make it really difficult for the reader to get into the story. On the other end of the spectrum, moving too slowly is likely to bore the reader, and they'll spend too much time waiting around for something to happen. There's a few ways to hit the sweet spot here between too limp of a beginning and a beginning that gives the reader whiplash. You could, for example, start immediately after something exciting has happened. So instead of your beginning being the actual car chase or the gunfight, your beginning is dealing with the aftermath of the car chase or the gunfight. This gives you the advantage of starting early with something exciting to hook the reader, but also lowers the pace of the beginning, which is a better environment for introducing characters. There are other ways to do this too. Just remember that it's best to slowly ease the reader into the story. You don't want too much action or information thrown at them too early, which ties nicely into tip number 2. Tip number 2, don't begin with an info dump or encyclopedia entry. In other words, don't burden your introduction with too much exposition. While a beginning overly laden with exposition is most prevalent in the sci-fi and fantasy genres, it can and likely does happen in nearly every genre out there. If the first few pages of your book begin with a lengthy and detailed history of the town where your romance story is happening, or the crime-laden history of the hotel where your mystery is taking place, then you really haven't done anything different than the fantasy author who's copy and pasted their world-building notes below the heading of chapter 1. There are several problems associated with starting a book this way. First, it's boring, and the reader is likely to only skim this information at best, and at worst, they're skipping over it entirely. This has the knock-on effect that if there's any crucial information about the plot of your story in the opening info dump, then the reader is likely going to have forgotten it, or not read it at all. You are also, by starting with an info dump, delaying the introduction of your characters. While an interesting world or setting can hook a reader into the story, the characters in that story or the plot that's happening in that story are usually a better way to hook the reader. And the longer you take to introduce the characters, the longer it takes to hook the reader. There are a lot of better ways to get expository details across to the reader that don't involve info dumping. In fact, I did a whole video about this a while ago, so rather than spend more time talking about that here, I'm just going to direct you there. Tip number 3, don't forget about the ending. If you take a step back and really look at things, the beginning only exists to set up the ending. Okay, I didn't say you needed to take a very big step back to realize that. I mentioned this last week when we talked about endings, but what goes in the beginning of a story is a major factor in how good the ending will be. Most great endings out there are great because of the groundwork that was laid down in the beginning of the story. The beginning that you write ultimately needs to fit with the ending of the story. That's why it's very common once you finish the first draft of a story to go back and rewrite the beginning to better fit the ending. You may have foreshadowing details that need to be added, character flaws that need to be adjusted, or maybe the tone of the beginning needs to be changed to fit with the ending. This is less of an issue if you're writing from an outline and have a good idea of where the story is going versus being a pantser and not really having any idea. That said, it can be hard to properly capture things like tone in an outline, so there's still a chance you need to go back. Either way, when you're thinking about the beginning of your story, always have an eye for how the story is going to end, just like this video is ending. Really, you can think of a beginning as serving a couple of different functions. One, it needs to hook the reader and get them engaged enough with your story to continue reading it. This is done by starting things off at a quick enough pace that they're interested but not overwhelmed, and by getting at the meat of the plot and characters quickly rather than spending most of the introduction on exposition. The second thing a beginning needs to do is set up the ending. Things like foreshadowing, character flaws, the tone, all need to be established in the beginning so that the ending can have the proper impact. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing advice videos every Wednesday. All the ones before this, there's just a wall back here. They're not a shelf. That's new, but you'll see it in future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.